conference organizers for opening up the sessions to the wider community and for allowing sessions that include unions, labor lawyers, and activists. And I think this is particularly important given how workers the world over are being battered by health and economic crises. And many are certainly worried about the present and fearful about what's coming next. And I think broader discussions are more necessary than ever if we're going to create a fairer, more resilient and sustainable world. As Ronna mentioned, please use the Q&A function at the end of the discussion. We've got plenty of time. And Ronna will also talk you through about the Q&A or raise your hand function if we need to at that time. I want to just talk a little bit about revitalization and union renewal. They've certainly been on the agenda of unions and progressive activists for more than 3 decades now. How to grow unions, build worker strength, and create the political power necessary to shape the priorities of our democracy are all issues that workers and unions, I think, around the world have been grappling with. But addressing these questions have been made much more difficult by the financial crisis, as well as by the recent COVID pandemic. Many unions have not only lost thousands of members, but workers themselves are more fearful and anxious due to unemployment, precarious jobs, or the simple lack of meaningful and safe work. So today, how can unions and labor movements take steps forward, and what can and should Canadian unions do to come out of the pandemic? What opportunities are there for organizing? And what should Canada's unions prioritize, and what should be their strategies? With us today to discuss these issues are Tanya Ferguson, a regional organizer for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Brad James, the recently retired National Organizing Coordinator for the United Steelworkers, and Bill Murnighan, the Director of Leadership Development for Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union. It's great to welcome all of you to our session this afternoon. I'd like to start off with talking about the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic certainly raises all kinds of very difficult issues, I think, for unions. Bill Fletcher, who's an activist in the United States, has recently written, "Organized labor is paralyzed at precisely the time when collective action is needed most. Since the election of Donald Trump and other right-wing governments across Europe, most unions have done little more than protect their own jurisdictions, offering guidance on what must be done during the pandemic. Yet the spread of COVID-19 and its economic fallout have created an opening for labor to lead a mass movement," he writes. While weaker in the past, trade unions are still among the few groups with enough resources to advance a transformation that addresses not just racial injustice, but also economic inequity, environmental catastrophe, and imperialism. Unless something dramatic is undertaken, he concludes, the aftermath of COVID-19 will be economic and social collapse. Brad, I wanted to start with you. Do you think Bill Fletcher's right? Are unions in Canada and the United States far too quiet today? And are Canada's unions, at least in the private sector, in danger of simply becoming afterthoughts for employers and governments alike?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks to you. And I'm also happy to be here with Bill and Tanya and hear their thoughts. And I'll try to be the curmudgeonly old retired guy here. I guess I'll say, first of all, the first part of your question, it's easy to agree with. Certainly. Unions are seen as a bit quiet. If you look at strike statistics or coverage of union gains, certainly things are quieter than most union supporters would want. But I think that Bill's comment is a little bit informed by the U.S. Private sector union density in the U.S. is maybe on a good day a little bit over 5%. Here in Canada, private sector density is certainly triple that. And so while I don't mean to say that things are better in Canada, I think that Bill's question, his comment is really informed from a really dangerous state for the U.S. private sector labor movement. But in the framing of the question too, I think to say that, and I know this is not your implication, but if the implication was taken that unions are simply a bit more, if they were more boisterous or more noisy, things would change. I just don't think that's the case. Union density and the challenges that we face has been really on a downward slide in U.S. and Canada for since the mid-60s, really much steeper in the US than in Canada. So this isn't a problem that just cropped up because unions are being a bit quiet and perhaps quieter in the US. So I think there's really, really big cyclical issues that are much more at play than simply, union reticence. But I will say, on the other hand, I think that unions don't aggressively enough promote their own institutional interests. Certainly during the pandemic, I haven't seen a lot of, and maybe I've missed the coverage, I haven't seen a lot of union leaders, at least on the private sector side, get out and make the case that despite the challenging conditions that all workers face, union and non-union, that unionized workers have a leg up. They have voice in the workplace. They have the ability to file grievances. They have the ability to defend their interests in a much more effective way. And there really hasn't been, I haven't seen a lot of union leaders making that case. And I will say that next thing I was going to say is that Unifor has spoiled me on this. I was going to say that I haven't seen also the labor movement during the pandemic make the case that legislatively across Canada that the rights of workers to join unions and the rights of workers to then engage in collective bargaining should be strengthened with any specificity at all. The CLC's manifesto that it issued recently barely mentions changes across Canada that should be made to enhance workers' ability to join unions and bargain. In the US, so that the loan provisions that are given to small and medium-sized businesses come with a requirement that employers take a neutral stance with respect to collective bargaining. But I do note, and all credit to Unifor in their recent package of proposals that came out, they do talk about the need for that kind of change here in Canada in response to the pandemic, and also the need even to move into areas like sectoral bargaining as a response to the impact of this pandemic on low-wage service sector workers. I think that's overdue, and so all credit to them. But generally, I'll say that I mean, I'll sort of agree a little bit around the quietude. Labor movement is not very good, I think, at tooting its own horn or promoting itself. If you look at the website of our National Labor Congress or our Provincial Labor Federation, I think you'd be hard pressed to find coverage of a collective bargaining victory, of an organizing victory, of a health and safety advancement, all of which are taking place in the labor movement. And there is very little celebration of union gains. There's a lot of celebration of struggle, and I think that's important. So from an organizer, I worked as an organizer for many years, and it was always frustrating that we wouldn't get much coverage of even in my own union. We eventually worked harder at doing this, but we are much more apt to spread the news about bad news than good news. And again, if you look at, I challenge you to look at the CLC's website or the OFL's and find evidence of a union victory in collective bargaining, of a strike won, of an organizing campaign achieved, and a first collective agreement achieved. If you can find that in 10 minutes, you're lucky. And so I do think we have to toot our own horn a bit more aggressively, but I really think unions are in a much better place in Canada than they are in the US, and I'll stop rambling.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad. I'm wondering about your take on this bill. Unifor has certainly been one of the more active unions over the past decade or more, in its founding in 2013 in the wake of the crisis. As a merger of the Canadian Auto Workers and the Communication, Energy and Paper Workers Union was to create a new union, one that commits to community involvement, one that commits to workplace organizing and political action. At least at that time, it certainly seemed to me and to many others that Unifor was really trying to recast itself and to deal with the kinds of problems that we're facing. It wasn't just about being quiet, it was about what the union was there for and who was it going to serve. I'm wondering, do you think it's actually been able to live up to these ideals over the past decade? And do you think it can continue to live up to these aspirations as we grapple with the pandemic now?
Well, thanks, John. Appreciate the question and appreciate the opportunity to join with Tanya and Brad and Rana and everyone who's watching in these interesting times. And that's a great question. I would like to just twig off of, I don't think Brad was at all being the old curmudgeon. In fact, super insightful, as he often is in so many forums. And the question that was raised by Bill Fletcher, I'll come to the union renewal project of Unifor, but I would say I would agree that some of that first discussion about whether or not unions are on the sidelines at the moment may be a little bit more influenced by what's happening south of the border than in Canada to some extent. Very similar trends happening here as well. But I guess I'd just offer, and maybe this will circle back into the union renewal part, that what's happened in Canada, at least from my simple perspective in terms of government support and the evolution of it, has the hands of the labor movement all over it from many perspectives. And while there's such a tumult of news and noise at the moment, I don't think your average citizen's gonna quite see it in the same way. But major engagement, I do think, from the major unions, the Canadian Labour Congress and our union, about shaping the kind of income support, social supports, industrial policy supports, particularly as they contrast so much with what's happening in a few other countries, particularly our neighbor to the south. So you know, it's hard to feel really positive about a lot at this moment, but I think you know, Brad raised that point, and I would agree with him that there is a little bit of a different vibe happening here, and a bit of a different relationship between different levels of government. And I think where we're landing on things like income support and other things have got the labor movement's hands on it. But to your big question about, that's a really big question, and I really enjoyed being posed it, about whether or not Unifor has lived up to its project. And I mean, you know, lots of lofty goals, lots of lofty ambitions were raised. The whole thing started, it was called the New Union Project. We hadn't unveiled our now seemingly normal name at the time. It took people by surprise, but we called it, and it was really very much about a union renewal. And, you know, yes, it was a merger of large unions, but they could have continued on as they had. It wasn't an absolutely necessary thing. And so very much it was about trying to transform and get at some of these broader questions about declining unionization and finding a new way to organize in new sectors. And in terms of have we lived up to that, that's a really tough question to answer fully. I would like total victories. They almost never happen in the labor movement. But I would certainly say that on many of the things that we thought about, we could put a check mark beside. And I would highlight community activism in particular, and building some structures and new structures across the country to have greater engagement with local unions and activists through regional councils, and carrying that work at the smaller level into towns and cities, and really trying to build new forums. And none of these things are going to make the headlines when you get 50 people together in New Brunswick or Central Ontario or some such thing, but it's actually happening across the country in a fairly remarkable way, I do think, and not by accident. Whether or not it's going to bear full fruit, that remains to be seen. These are long-term questions, but I would say very much that has been one of the real features. If you look at the kind of levels of engagement among activisms on all sorts of campaigns and others, that's a lot different. And this question, I'm glad well, I know at least one person saw it, so Brad saw it, the launch of Unifor at this time, and we're not the only ones by any means. All sorts of progressive elements of society are pitching forward to say that we can't just rebuild our economy as it was. And so a good slogan, of course, is called Build Back Better, and we just launched a vision, and it's really trying to anchor a campaign. And by no means is this an exclusive Unifor type activity. This is happening from different progressive elements across the country to say, look, we can't just see what happened where essential workers, retail workers, healthcare workers got treated terribly at very low pay. And we offered a 5-plank, I won't bore you with all the details of it, but there are 5 key planks of what we're advocating now around income security, green jobs, building infrastructure, domestic industrial capacity, since we have so much manufacturing, which is really challenged at the moment, and making sure that when we support corporations, there's a very strong set of conditions that they must meet. So in terms of coming out of the pandemic and some of our priorities, those will be cornerstones of what we're advocating. And I think you'll find as the immediate crisis passes, a lot of people are turning their attention to, well, now what? We're not just going to rebuild where we were, because there was a lot of problems there. So we have to make things a lot better, and we'll look forward to that. I suppose just as before I stop rambling on here, a full review of kind of what's happened in Unifor since our founding. I'll put a plug for my friend and colleague Fred Wilson's book called A New Kind of Union, which was launched last spring, which was a review of the formation of our union and a temperature check on where we've come for some good summer reading since we're all stuck at home. So I'll leave it at that plug, but a great question and a tough one to answer fully.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. I'm going to pick up on that Build Back Better idea and turn to you, Tanya. Certainly, the public sector has seen over the past decade or so In the wake of the financial crisis, unions faced all kinds of austerity demands for continuing tax cuts, layoffs, privatization, cuts to public services. I'm wondering, I know that PSAC is getting back to the bargaining table, but I'm wondering, is there sort of a Build Back Better vibe that we can see perhaps in PSAC or in other public sector unions? Are they going to come out of this stronger or with a new sense of purpose, or do you think they're just going to simply fall back into something of a survival mode?
So I also wanted to join the other panelists in saying thanks for the invitation and thanks for the question as well, John. From my point of view, I'm newer to the public sector and I'm newer to PSAC, but I think that yes, PSAC can come back and can come out stronger after this pandemic. I think that it's entirely possible that public sector unions and actually private sector unions as well, because private sector unions will be facing, in some cases, diminished resources associated with layoffs. But I think it's possible that there's going to be that pressure to go into survival mode. There's no doubt about that. And there's good reason for that, in the sense that, you know, there is a lot of work to do to secure safety in workplaces as people go back to work, and I understand that. But I also think it's possible that unions are going to resist that temptation to just turn inward. And that there's an opportunity to put some emphasis on organizing new workers, people who aren't currently members of unions. So I think that Bill touched on this, but my observation through this pandemic has been that unionized workers have experienced the pandemic differently, especially in the early stages of COVID, in the sense that they have been able to have higher expectations of their employer with respect to like transparency and communication. And in a health crisis, those are things that are extremely important and can't be overstated. And those are things that are relevant for me as an organizer, because lack of transparency and poor communication, these are the kinds of things that motivate people to join unions in the first place. They're usually a symbol of a workplace that has, you know, a power imbalance that's skewed in favor of management. And so when I look at what our own members have experienced, I really feel that there needs to be an impulse for union members to be part of this next process of inviting new workers into this union and being involved with organizing drives. I think it's a starting point to unionize. I think that organizing, you know, is not only going to be an opportunity to expand the ranks of the union, which is obvious, but the practice of organizing and the act of organizing, it's also a kind of an education for union members and for the union as an organization. It improves the culture and it improves the capacity of the union to take on the risky fights and to take on this sort of like, there's this looming sense that there's an austerity agenda coming. And so building our capacity to respond in ways where we have to win, where we have to build majorities, I think that that is a place that PSAC and other public sector unions can take what we have and push and expand. So, you know, yes, I think there's going to be tough fights at the bargaining table, but I don't think this is the moment to turn inward. I think this is the moment to organize.
Great couple of points. And I'm wondering if, Tanya, you mentioned this issue about impulse, about what's going to draw workers and what's going to make them be interested in kinds of unions. But also, and Brad mentioned that in some cases unions are really quite quiet. And I'm wondering if there is a bit of a different vibe, what accounts for why in both countries we've seen strikes drop off so much? And I ask this question because Jeremy Brecker, who's a longtime union activist in the United States, has written, if workers don't know how to go on strike, they're going to be in trouble. And I'm wondering, you know, if he has a point, because if looking at our history, the rise of industrial unions in the 1930s, it certainly didn't happen through orderly labor board elections and card check certifications. Unions took open-ended strikes, they launched workplace occupations, they disrupted supply chains, mobilized their communities, and engaged in rank-and-file struggles for union democracy. I think that there's an argument to be made. It was all these actions that really helped bring a labor movement to birth. And then in the 1960s, millions of public sector workers followed up on this by taking matters into their own hands and launching strikes themselves to win union representation by law. In all these instances, I think strikes were militant and they were massive, and they were a real impulse for building not only unions, but building for a different society and a very different kind of democracy. And they won all kinds of major labor law reforms, as well as social program breakthroughs. Bill, I want to start with you on this question. Unifor has been involved in more than a few major strikes and lockouts now in recent years. The current lockout at the Co-op refinery in Regina and the DJ Composites strike in Newfoundland are just two off the top of my head. I'm wondering, should unions again be prioritizing key industries and taking strikes, both legal and illegal, to win gains and also to really make a difference?
Excellent question. And yeah, on the, I mean, the co-op strike, for those who may have followed that, just a very quick update, just ratified a collective agreement this past week. And the tentative agreement was reached after 197 days of lockout. And I've been fortunate enough over a couple decades actually to have a good ringside seat on things. And this was one of the most remarkably outrageous things I had ever seen in my experience, with a super profitable corporation taking such a hard stand, seeking concessions and essentially to break the union. And, you know, 197 days with scab camps built inside the facility, helicopter shuttles, you know, picket lines in up to a dozen different locations. It was quite stunning. I can finally feel my toes again after walking around in those lines in the middle of the winter for a while. Nothing compared to the actual members who were there throughout. But the reason to just give a little more flavor of that dispute, and like the DJ Composite, is I think that you know, there might be a different vibe out there, and it's among employers who are actually remarkably you know, not all of them, but there seems to be a renewed militancy among some employers to be willing to engage in the two that you mentioned were lockouts and not strikes. And in fact, some of the most acrimonious situations in the last number of years in the labor movement, and our union as well, have been lockouts on the employer's initiative. And so I would say that there's certainly a mood out there, an ability to do that. And in terms of union strategy, you know, I think workers never choose to go on strike as their first strategy. But I think perhaps I'll read into your question that we should be much more prepared to strike. We should be making sure that our institution, our organization has the strength to do it. And to carry it out. And it's not just the institution, it's preparing our members to be able to say, you know what, forget it. I'm not putting up with this, and to be able to join a picket line and take the crazy radical action of putting their hands in their pocket, not going to work for a while, and follow through. And so in terms of a strategy, and I've been quite impressed about the broad public support. You know, a lot of political scientists talk about a willingness these days for all sorts of radical solutions. From my perspective, some of them on the right, which are terrifying, but also on the left, there's people open to a lot of different ideas these days. And the people who've been on strike and been on picket lines and lockouts and so on, it's quite eye-opening for them and transformative, and a lot of community support. So I think there is an appetite in terms of strategy. Again, I'll just say, I think, you know, we prefer to settle collective agreements, but as your opening quote said, you have to exercise those muscles sometimes, make sure you know how to do it. And, you know, unfortunately, employers give us a chance far too often to have to show that we actually have the strength to either defend our members or seek gains. So as a strategy, I think that's it, is make sure you know how to do it, you're ready, and you're prepared, and not so worried about it. Of course, there's limits to it, and we don't match the power of the other side, that's for sure. But I think we should be prepared, and, you know, I think many unions have. I would say that's one of the founding kind of strategies of Unifor, was to have a bit more of a militant outlook towards their ability to stand up to defend our members. So that's a bit of a roundabout way to answer the question. And I'll stop there.
Well, I'll follow up with Brad, because certainly what I saw in Sudbury in 2009, 2011 was the big multinational mining operation Vale. And it certainly was, as Bill mentioned, militant. And it wasn't so much militant, but it was certainly aggressive in trying to wring concessions out of USW 6500. And the company there just simply held out long enough to keep operating at a modest level until it wrung the concessions it actually wanted. So I can see the argument being made by Jeremy Brecker as well as by Jane McAlevey that, you know, unions need to take more strikes. But I guess the question is it just about taking more strikes, or is it taking more successful strikes? Because if companies are too powerful, isn't that a pretty risky strategy for creating unions, Brad?
Well, I'm not, I was not a bargainer for the Steelworkers. I was an organizer, and most of my, and then helping run first contract bargaining campaigns. And, you know, I think it's important not to romanticize the 1940s too much here. I mean, certainly in mid 1946, 10% of the US workforce was on strike. You know, like 1.5 million people were out on strike. And I think it is important not to romanticize back to that past and think that we can somehow snap our fingers and get there. In no organizing campaign that I've run, can I think of an employee who approached me and said, you know, the first thing I want to do when we get organized is go on strike. But that said, we are presented, as Bill said, with some pretty aggressive employers these days. Strike rates are down. They've been dropping for 40 years, steadily down. We're seeing more lockouts, and the strikes that we are seeing are longer. So, you know, you don't see many unicorns, but when you see them, they're big. And that's what's been happening. I guess I'll say that, you know, it's obvious the strike weapon in the private sector is not as strong as it used to be, with the global capital, with the fissuring of the workplace, with trade arrangements the way they are. There's no question that the strike weapon is a weaker weapon than before. So I agree fully with Bill that advanced preparation, internal mobilization, building a community and broader outreach, but having one's research ready to know the business plan of the employer before the picket line goes up is obviously important. And that's why larger unions are blessed. The 3 unions that are represented here are blessed with research departments that can provide that kind of strategic capacity. And so, you know, while on the other hand, though, you know, if it, like I always say about the media, it's the nasty stuff that gets covered. If it bleeds, it leads to headlines. The valet strike, certainly in Sudbury, the co-op strike, which has just ended in Regina, both of these strikes, or both of these disputes, the local unions take the view that it was the employer's goal to crush the union, and the employer didn't succeed in either of those strikes. In doing that, the union survives, although they were very challenging outcomes. On the other hand, just to give a plug for my own organization, our members in Alma, Quebec, Rio Tinto, were locked out in 2011, 2012 for 6 months by this 3rd largest mining company in the world. A range of concessions that were pushed by the company. None of those major concessions were achieved. Our members stood strong. They were locked out. We engaged in an internationally supported campaign. The unions here on this call and others all supported us. And that didn't get a lot of coverage, perhaps because good news doesn't get a lot of coverage. Equally, we just recently, our union just ended the longest strike in the forest sector in Western Canada against Western forest products, in which numerous improvements were obtained. None of the company's major concessions were obtained. And it was a strike that made very little coverage, you know, sort of east of Alberta. And so there are good examples of large bargaining units going on strike or being locked out and defending themselves that don't get as much coverage. I don't mean to minimize the challenging outcomes that exist in situations like in Regina or in things like our union's experience with Valet. But I think, you know, I've been helped in my career in a very, very tangential way in some small strikes where our preparation wasn't good going in. And that's not the fault of the employees. That's not the fault of the members. That's a strategic vacuum that sometimes exists in the union. So I couldn't agree with Bill's point more, that preparation before, having one's research done and taken care of, and having a plan for both picket line activity if necessary and broader outreach is necessary. But I also think that a lot of local union leaders are, you know, kind of run off their feet in bargaining and in daily membership representation, and need the backing of a larger organizations to provide that strategic support. And with so many bargaining units, that the 3 unions here have, you know, thousands of bargaining units providing that strategic support is a challenge when our resources are constrained. So anyway, I want to get a plug in for two very good labor disputes that we were able to end successfully, both against Western Forest Products and against Rio.
you bring up a big issue about, whether or not, unions are prepared and what their sort of strategies might be going forward, whether in strikes or in elsewhere. And I guess I know that there's certainly a debate in the American labor movement, but I'd like to hear what the Canadian perspective is on this, on the alt labor strategies. Here we're seeing a slide from one of the Fight for 15 campaigns that were going on in the United States. And I know that unions like the SEIU and others have been looking for new ways to sort of organize and prioritize where the resources are going to go. And this is largely because the rules are stacked against unions in Canada. Getting into a union requires complicated workplace ballots, and workforces routinely face employer opposition. Consequently, many more unions have been looking for more innovative ways, and rather than organize directly in workplaces or sign workers up to a union, more and more are instead seeking to build community support first in order to pressure employers or spark a social movement of low-wage workers, like the Fight for 15. But I think what's most striking about the Fight for 15 actions over the past few years, at least for me and for many academics, is how thousands of workers have campaigned for major wage improvements. But most notably is that they've actually succeeded where hundreds of campaigns have failed before. Tanya, your former union, Workers United, certainly was on that sort of trajectory of alt labor type strategies, and it was involved in more than a few such efforts, like organizing workers at Good Life Fitness, which, for those of you who are not from Canada, is Canada's largest health club company, but also a major employer of precarious workers. I'm wondering, Tanya, could you tell us a little bit about that campaign and how it differed from a traditional organizing campaign? But could you also comment on whether an organizing model focused on the community and perhaps the tactical use of media to pressure employers, is that something that all unions should be considering adopting today?
I think that it was important because Workers United is very specifically not a big union. We were a small union. And even though the union had, very long, rich history of organizing, it had so many different name changes, for example, that we didn't experience any growth because people knew the name of the union or remembered it from having had it in their workplace from years ago. So when we were looking at trying to reignite an organizing program, we had to sort of think of it as how to invite workers into not just like a specific labor organization, but into a labor movement. And that's how we were able to take on, like, Good Life is a pretty big company for a small union. And at the time that we ran that drive, my coworkers in Manitoba were also trying to organize at Tim Hortons, and they were successful in some cases. So that's how we were able to take on a big company as a small union. We were organizing around the time that the 15 in Fairness campaign was very active in Ontario. And that was one way that we were able to think about how to start to behave like a movement. Some of the things that we had going for us is that we did have staff organizers and member organizers on the ground with the 15 in Fairness campaign. This really helped I think we all learned from this. It helped, that campaign was really helping the media to understand labor in a new way and invite new voices into how we think about labor. And that softened the media up in terms of their interest in labor stories. So when we launched Good Life, we actually had some pretty significant media coverage that we wouldn't have pursued actually in a normal campaign because it was too early. But that media coverage actually, it amplified the kinds of critiques that workers in an industry like the fitness industry, where there were 0 unions before, it amplified the critique that workers had of their employer, and it gave people more confidence. We were able to build more quickly. And just as an organizing tool, it was much easier to talk to people who thought they were independent contractors when you could text them a message from the Star and say, like, have you heard of this? And when you could refer to things, people felt validated that their working conditions were worthy of talking about. I think it was also something where we were kind of, at the time, without knowing it, we were sort of like living what we were asking for. So we were at the height of this effort to reform labor laws, and we were working with an organizing committee where we could actually say, if this bill passes, we could have access to a list like this. If this bill passes, this is how it would make it easier to organize your colleagues, in another region in this company. So and those moments were really important for us as a union. The other thing is that just the reality of these types of employment situations, the turnover, there was a lot of challenges, and my most memorable challenge was the turnover at this company, and the breadth of different working experiences. So you had in some cases teachers, somebody would teach literally one class a week or one class a month. So they worked for this employer for 1 hour a week or a month. You also had people who were trying to build their full living as a personal trainer. So you had a whole range of experiences, and people turned people who wanted to build a career in this section of the economy and fitness, because Good Life was such a major player, everyone was impacted by it, whether you worked for Good Life in the moment, or whether you had worked for them or you intended to work for them in the future. What we found was that it was a community where everyone had some interaction with Good Life. And as a result, our organizing committee ended up being a group of people where some people worked for Good Life and some people didn't. Some people had a partner who worked for Good Life and they wanted to keep in the loop, or they had worked there for 3 weeks and signed a card and then moved on. So it was like nothing I'd seen before, in the sense that a lot of workers had stakes in this. And so we were able to sort of learn from community organizers and imitate the types of things that they were doing, and in having more broad and not so narrow organizing committees. Other things we were able to do, because that were different than traditional organizing campaigns. Our traditional campaigns were, things where we built discreetly on the inside. We had a trusted committee, and then we grew from there. It's not that it's a novel idea. I know other unions do it, but we had a public call. We had a public campaign website, because so many of our members and so many people in the labor movement were customers of Good Life. And so they had interactions with people who there was a curiosity and an excitement there. So those are tools that I think are really important for smaller unions, because, like, the two previous panelists have said, these employers are big and strong, but there are still these openings to organize.
Brad, I know you've been involved in lots of different kinds of organizing campaigns, traditional and non-traditional. What's your thoughts on this? I know that there's more workers in precarious jobs than ever, and I know that unions are trying out all kinds of different strategies. But is it a question of not having the proper strategy, or is it a question really that unions just need to devote more resources to organizing, more money, more members, and actually also find ways to coordinate with other unions to actually get organizing done?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of more cooperation, and maybe I can say that more aggressively now that I'm no longer on the direct payroll of my union that I was. I do think there's with the labor movement and the challenges it faces, there's no question that more cooperation between unions, especially within certain sectors, is a crying need, I think. But on the whole alt labor thing, I mean, I'm a country music fan, and I always hear about alt labor, alt country. I never know what I'm supposed to listen to. But on the whole alt labor front, a lot of the activity in the US has taken place because of the Article 7 or Section 7 right to concerted action that employees have in the non-union environment in the US, a right that doesn't exist here. I think some people think that it should come here, but I think that absent a mechanism to build durable bargaining units from that kind of ferment in the non-union sector, especially in the service sector, fast food and so on, where people are precariously employed, but they clearly are employees. I think absent a sectoral bargaining model to build into, I think that Section 7 right to concerted action will mean that there's lots of concerted action and not a lot of concerted density being built. And certainly in the US, the wave of activity around alt labor and the fight for 15 has been impressive, and I don't know anything about it in detail, but I do know that we haven't seen a resulting bump in private sector union density from those very significant gains in terms of minimum wage increases and so on. My experience on the alt labor side, at least in our union, in providing a different form of service and representation to workers, is in the taxi industry. I had some involvement at the edges of that. My colleagues had much more. In the 1990s, early 1990s, our union was involved in establishing certificates and bargaining rights for taxi workers in Ontario. Ultimately, because of the structure of in Toronto specifically, ultimately because of the market and the structure, no collective agreements resulted that were durable. And although we have recently begun to represent taxi drivers in Saskatchewan, we didn't build membership in the traditional sense in Montreal or Toronto. Our activities then morphed into this kind of service sector advocacy association type representation for taxi drivers. Ultimately, though, all of those efforts were really plagued by funding challenges. It's very, very hard to build those kind of organizations with a fairly high, and I'll just say this, that union staff reps are much better paid than precarious workers. It's very difficult to deliver a decent level of service to precarious workers unless they're built into the union dues structure, given the fairly high cost structure that unions necessarily undergo. And so our efforts, were challenging on both funding front and the governance front in trying to provide those kind of services to taxi drivers, whether it was services around cheaper products like insurance or services around representation for speeding and driving tickets and so on. So it's a real financial struggle for unions. I'm actually not convinced that trade unions themselves, at least as we're currently constituted, have the internal capacity to take on running and delivering our capabilities to alt labor organizations. I think there are many other organizations that are much more rooted in the community that we could work with that have those skills, and that we need to be building more durable relationships with them. Some of that, I think, was in the air around the time of the Changing Workplaces Review in Ontario. I think there was admirable cooperation between community groups and advocacy groups and unions around the changes that needed to happen. And I think it would have been, I guess my preference is that I don't think internally, at least in my own union, we had the capability to go and start and sustain for a long period of time an alternative form of representation for workers who weren't actually going to be declared to be employees in the employee-employer sense. We can much more effectively work with organizations that have much more effective community roots and try to support them durably. Certainly in the really excellent organizing campaign that Tanya just mentioned with the Good Life, I mean, that was taking workers who were independent contractors, ensuring their status to be dependent contractors and winning them union bargaining rights, that kind of stuff, and the Foodora work we should all continue to do. But I also note that gig workers, I think as they're defined, represent about 10% of the Canadian workforce in general, maybe not even quite 10%. And some gig workers, a few, are pretty well paid. I think the labor movement needs to spend a lot more time on the private service sector, franchise workers, people who are clearly employees, but who, the Tim Hortons work that the OFL undertook a couple of years ago was I thought the start of something that if we'd had a more coordinated and cooperative approach, we could have pushed on. So I think there's much more work to do, alt labor aside, much more work to do, I think, around building a durable model of bargaining for low-wage private service sector workers. It's going to require multiple unions to cooperate instead of running. And I take nothing away from the really significant victories around Foodora, but they do gain a lot of attention. And there are lots of people for whom employee status is not the issue. It's how we, the labor movement, can reach out and deliver a durable bargaining model to them, not just organizing one. I'm so old, I remember the McDonald's organizing campaign in Orangeville, and it was going to herald something for the future. It heralded nothing. And so there's lots of room and soul searching that we should do in the labor movement about the private service sector and how to address it. Security work, food service work, franchise employees. It's crying out for us to cooperate and deliver a better approach. And there's lots of experience around the labor movement to do it.
I think you raise up lots of sort of very interesting sort of points about, how do you sort of square the circle when you have all these different kinds of problems, whether it's labor law problems, you have major multinational employers, which are very aggressive. You have lack of resources inside of unions. All these sorts of problems, I think, pose really sort of major challenges for unions. I guess, though, I'd like to still push you a little bit more. That I'm wondering if there still isn't just a bit of a new wine into old bottles problem. I mean, all of you have discussed that, yes, Canadian unions have a different vibe. Yes, Canadian unions are having more success than we often hear. But I'm wondering if, even though we are seeing some of these new directions, many of the same old problems are continuing to recur. And I guess the question I would have for you, Brad, is it not, USW has probably been one of the most active and innovative unions in recent decades. It's signed new transnational agreements with other international unions. It's worked with environmentalists to forge a blue-green alliance in the United States. It's spoken out on a host of issues, from jobs to trade to industrial policy. But it still seems that the USW in Canada and the United States is just, well, to be frank, treading water. I'm wondering, do you think it's just, as I sort of pushed you again, is this what the problem is? Is it that business is too powerful and labor laws can't be reformed? Or is it that unions are not doing enough to actually realize that they're never going to be able to get that kind of change, and they actually have to take more radical and far more innovative steps outside their comfort zone if they're going to see any kind of really progressive transformation?
I think I'll take a little bit of issue with you, John, saying that we're treading water. I think we're if we're treading water, all of we have 8 arms and 8 legs, and they're all moving at the same time to keep us where we are. And like Bill and like Tanya's organization, we're active on a wide range of fronts these days, on everything from defending our members on trade issues and the possible recurrence of tariffs on steel and aluminum, to extensive organizing, everything from, and again, I'll talk about the numbers in a minute. The numbers overall, I think, are not great. I mean, in Ontario, close to half of the bargaining units that are organized each year for the last year have been units under 20 members per unit. And most of those bargaining, this is in non-construction, and most of those units, I think, are not connected as employers. So unions are importing up a pretty challenging cost structure in terms of representation in small workplaces. But we just won an important decision recently on at the Workers' Comp Board on the effect of McIntyre powder in the mining industry on workers who have Parkinson's. We're active in mergers, active in organizing, and it's not getting much coverage because other things are taking precedence. So I don't really agree with you on treading water. I think I will say this though, I think local union leaders, people who are working at the local level in leading mid and large size locals, are tremendously busy these days, dealing with all of their daily representation and bargaining work issues. And that's the majority of the work that unions do, is representing their members on a daily basis in bargaining, in organizing. It doesn't get much coverage. And so it maybe looks like we're treading water, but underwater, that, like I said, there are thousands of legs moving aggressively. So it doesn't leave a lot of time to innovate. When you're a local union leader, it doesn't leave a lot of time to innovate. Recently, we and some other unions did innovate and try to represent our members' interests in pension negotiations. We built a multi-employer, jointly sponsored pension plan in the university sector that took cooperation with our union internally, multiple units, multiple locals with different employers, cooperation with other unions. And we did innovate and build something different from the ground up. But in respect of organizing, I agree with what Bill and Tanya said, that building a durable model for the service sector is vitally important. I think it is, I'll go out on a limb here and say, I think it's unlikely that Premier Doug Ford is going to bring in a sectoral bargaining law, despite, look, the Liberals didn't do it, and the NDP didn't advocate for it very much at all. In the NDP's platform in the last election, the mention of sectoral bargaining was slightly more than a footnote, but it wasn't its own bullet point. Like, it didn't even merit its own bullet point. And so do we expect legislative change imminently? I'd say I look at my watch that I haven't got and say no. So what can we begin to do as unions? The Labor Relations Act, Section 12 of the Labor Relations Act, allows unions to build a council of trade unions that can hold bargaining rights with multiple unions there. Do we have the will and ability to share political responsibility, dues revenue, to do that on a sectoral basis. In the security sector, in the food services sector, in the building cleaning sector, are there opportunities where there is density and there are a number of dominant unions to work together and do that? Do we have the ability to be cooperative? I know that might be controversial in the labor movement, but can we do that? And so that's a level of innovation that's hard to get to because of the daily demands that local union leaders and senior union leaders face in trying to keep their organizations really treading water. And sometimes bringing their shoulders up above the water if we can. So I think there is room for innovation. For me, it is around the cooperation in terms of building a durable bargaining structure, because it's not going to come legislatively, at least in the next 6 months.
Well, if it's not going to come legislatively, I'm wondering can we find the people power that might be able to drive that sort of change? I mean, I would think that some, certainly in the United States as well as elsewhere, have seen the pandemic and have seen the major massive gatherings for racial justice in the United States and around the world as sort of a new opportunity to begin to sort of push all kinds of new items and much more progressive policy positions onto the world stage. And I'm wondering, Tanya, if I could ask you, in comparison to protests in the past, these seem very different in their scope and persistence. And I think the argument could be made they could be unprecedented in recent US history, and they also seem to be picking up steam internationally. But I'm wondering, do you think Canadian unions are ready to take on the economic and racial injustices that we're seeing in the United States? And do you think that Canada's unions could actually seize the opportunity now to build upon similar kinds of activism?
I mean, I think that the thing that's exciting about this is that I think Canadian unions are not ready or were not ready, but this global swell is kind of forcing everyone to deal with it. And I agree, it is different. I have seen solidarity for Black lives in a way that I've never seen. And I actually didn't understand on a personal level how discouraged I was about anti-Black racism until I witnessed some of these demonstrations and been there and seen the possibility of the other side of this. I think that what Brad's been saying about unions not promoting the positives, like these are things that I think Black struggles have dealt with, in the sense that we've just had to figure out how to teach each other and how to forget about positive media coverage and learn from each other. And I think there's such an exciting opportunity there, because workers join unions to shift power dynamics at work. It's always the reason why people take steps and take risks to form a union. And that's what we're seeing in this struggle, is that people want to see a different world and a different power relationship. There's been goodwill, and also I think, to some extent, like lip service about bringing in youth and bringing in people of color and things like that within the labor movement. And so now we're looking at a model where this is a movement led by young people of color, which is really exciting. And they're being bolder than I could ever ask people to be in terms of what they're asking for. These are all, I think, lessons for us as a movement. But what attracted me in terms of becoming a union organizer was that we also learned how to build majorities and how to win on things. So I think that this is a point where the movement has that we can teach each other and we can learn from each other. The other thing that I wanted to say here, and I think is interesting, is that anti-racism and anti-colonial agenda has also disrupted capital. We saw that with the Wet'suwet'en protests, and earlier this year, and now we're seeing that it's not just business as usual with the Black Lives Solidarity protest, that there is an actual disruption, and that's also part of a labor tradition. And within the labor movement, anyone who's been trying to push racism as a priority, I think has had the experience that's been challenged. It's been questioned as to whether or not that should be front and center at struggle. And now we have a huge swell saying that this is part of our analysis. We have tools saying this is part of our analysis of the economy that we participate in, and that people can disrupt capital because of an anti-racist agenda and an anti-colonial agenda. So this is like a very, whether we're ready or not, this is a moment that we can learn, and we can learn to kind of like learn to learn and know that we don't know everything, and also know that we have a tradition, that we have something to offer as well. And on a personal note, or not personal to me, but personal to PSAC, I should say, today we filed for a group, nonprofit workers at the Ontario Labour Relations Board, and their entry point into unionizing, the reason they picked up the phone and joined PSAC is because they wanted to deal with systemic racism in their workplace. Like, there were complaints about systemic racism. There's outside allegations at this organization. And these are people who chose to form a union. And so I think this is actually transformative in terms of this can change unions, and this can also change workplaces, that workers are seeing that unions are a resource and an avenue to take these things on. So, you know, I'm really happy to be, that this is a conversation that's even at this table at this moment.
Another question, Brad, you mentioned this a number of times. You know, certainly USW and both its bargaining reps as well as its local executives, you know, face all kinds of time constraints about what they can do. And Annalise Kruger is asking, aren't there more ways that perhaps we could find, unions could try to think about efficiencies or find different kinds of ways so that all that kind of time and effort isn't just simply taken up with bargaining issues or with grievance kinds of issues? Are there ways that unions themselves internally could perhaps restructure so that they'd be able to take on more of the kinds of tasks that are necessary given the challenges they face?
You know, I'll just say quickly, I think there's certainly lots of structures in the steelworkers because they've existed forever, they exist forever. I think that probably is the same with a lot of unions, that the way we've done it is the way we do it because that's the way we've always done it. And then we write it into the Constitution. But these are challenging. It's certainly various people who are listening may know more, but the SEIU in the US tried to move some of its day-to-day servicing responsibilities from its reps to free up its reps to do advocacy and campaign work and move those into almost to a union, to a call center type system of delivery, so that, you know, day-to-day inquiries could be handled more efficiently. I think that was controversial. I don't know the results of it. I studied it about 10 years ago. But I did, if I could just take the moment to throw in something that Tanya mentioned, her campaign with Good Life, and she talked about how public it was. That's something I regret not doing more of when I was organizing, is bringing campaigns out publicly, ensuring sometimes when we run organizing campaigns, we try to emphasize, we keep in the shadows, we stay quiet. And I think we exacerbate people's natural and understandable feelings of fear. When we organize, we should, where possible, where it makes sense, follow her approach and be more open from the beginning and leave the membership cards to a little bit later, but organize openly and build union organizing as they would say in the US, as a civil right. I'd like to see more of that. So I think it was good that she brought that up. And I wanted to say, I wish I'd done more of that back when I was actually running campaigns.
I could chime in briefly on the efficiency question, John.
Yeah.
I think it's a really, again, I would also echo Brad's points about, you know, whether it's inertia, you know, no union was ever built on a drawing board in the scientist lab. It's by hook and by crook and by struggle and whatever we managed to do that week, that decade. And you end up with a bit of a, you know, big gobbledygook of structures and so on as you go forward. And of course it still works and nothing to be ashamed of. That's just how we develop. But at the same token, do we have the right, you know, we have the right machines in the right places, the right tools? And some of those questions, I'll offer two thoughts. One of them that, you know, we think of and we talked about already today is our bargaining model. You know, can we get the sectoral or pattern bargaining where we're going to bargain one collective agreement for 200 car dealerships in Southern Ontario instead of dealing with them one at a time? That could certainly, you know, these might be moonshots, but actually we've done it before. And this is a kind of structural question that would free up resources and time for other matters. And then also it's your structure about, you know, kind of who does what. Different models of local unions, staffing models, who has what resources where, whether or not we have large, well-equipped and resourced locals, whether or not we have smaller locals, how and what responsibilities can be done where are important questions as well. And it's a bit of a circle with the question about smaller workplaces. You know, it's how are you going to get a committee together when you've only got 100 people in the workplace and develop expertise and send people to education and so on. It's not like it's a simple thing to do, but maybe there are different ways to amalgamate across workplaces in a community and build enough capacity so that some of that work and knowledge happens at that level instead of only through professionalized servicing. But these are kind of long questions, but those are some of my thoughts when we raise that question.
Tanya, we're going to run out of time, so I just want some of your final thoughts on that. I mean, I think unions are in a very difficult spot in terms of having to make some hard decisions and set some priorities. I'm wondering if you could just very quickly tell us about where do you think PSAC is going to go? Is it worried about a new austerity agenda? And what are your expectations and goals for PSAC going forward?
I mean, I think that if it were up to me, PSAC should scale up on the things that they're already doing well. So I think workplace safety and defending public services and defending collective agreement or collective bargaining as a principle, I think those things need to be there. What I've seen in the pandemic, even just I come from like a family and a community of healthcare workers, and many of them were promised this $4 an hour by Doug Ford. People haven't seen that, and the frustration is misdirected towards unions or even towards employers. But these are things that happen outside of a collective bargaining table. And I think that it's important that unions are like prepared to do political and mass education so that members can defend collective bargaining, because this is what this looks like when, you know, a premier gets to pick and choose who gets what. I think that stuff is going to be really important. But to have discussions about priorities in organizations where organizing is marginal, or to change structures, or to change, you know, how we do things as unions, I think organizing needs to have a big voice there, because like within our union structures, there really isn't anyone to speak for the non-union workers, and we're not going to survive or be credible organizations without bringing and inviting more people into this movement. So I think that our priority needs to be, whatever happens next, we dig in on providing resources to expand this movement. And even on the comments that I made earlier around anti-racism, I think expanding the movement in terms of, you know, making sure that anti-racism and anti-colonialism is part of the movement. I think that is should be a priority for PSAC to the extent that it isn't already.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tanya. Brad, maybe we'll give you the last word. You're retired now, so you can speak a bit more freely than some of the other union reps here today. I'll give you a magic wand. If you could get the best activists and staff and leaders all into a room, what would you like to convince them first to do to win new gains for workers and hopefully build back a better Canada?
Gee, thanks. I get to say things. Well, a couple things. Like, you know, if I had a magic wand, like I said, I'd go back to the campaigns that I was privileged to be part of, with people who were leading them, who were the employees themselves. I'd leave the card till a little later in the campaign. I'd be more open at the beginning. If I had a magic wand, I would. What would I do? If I had a magic wand, I would try to gather as many labor leaders in a room as we could, let's say just in Ontario, and I would, what would you do? We'd lock the door so nobody could get out. And we would have those, you know, Chatham House rules that whatever is said in the room stays in the room, and we don't report it out, and have a real hard look at union density trends, have a really hard look at what public opinion polling tells us about union approval rates and how people consider the instrumentality of unions, have a really hard look at organizing results, at an analysis of the number of people who are joining unions in Ontario, just to speak about Ontario, over the last 10 years and what the projections are. I mean, we're in the non-construction bargaining units in Ontario, we're organizing between 8,000 and 10,000 new members a year in Ontario. That isn't, you know, is that enough to tread water? I'd say obviously not, given some of the stuff that Bill mentioned, which my own union experiences as well, organizing new members, but losing members as there's industrial churn on the other side. So in that room, I'd stick the wand across the door so nobody could get out, and have a really hard discussion among union leaders about exactly the levels of resources that are allocated and devoted to organizing, and have a catalog of what those resources are, how they're structured, who does the organizing. If we set priorities about organizing but don't assign anybody to it, both inside unions and also centrally in a cooperative sense, it's not going to get done. In addition to cataloging those resources and having a really hard look at where union density trends are going to take us. I want to remind union leaders that it's not their fault that we're here. It's not their fault we're in this. We inherited this situation, but it's partially their responsibility and our members' responsibility to help us get out of it. And then I'd try to turn the conversation to some of this multi-union cooperative organizing approaches, absent any legislative change that's on it, because we don't see any of that on the horizon for the next few weeks. In looking at sectoral, regional, cooperative approaches to building durable bargaining units that can be serviced effectively. That's what I do. I'll also recommend an article from 2013 by a guy called Rich Jesselson called Fortress Unionism. It was somewhat controversial at the time in Democracy Magazine. Lots of that rings true to me because we want to preserve these institutions for when employees, when workers are ready. Union organizing in a mass level takes place in spurts when employees stand up and demand it, and we have to preserve these institutions so that when they demand it more than they are demanding it now, that we're ready to do so. And so then I'd let people out of the room. That's what I do. You know, defend where we have high density now. Work more effectively with organizations on the ground that can deliver alt labor services better than we can as unions, and build something effective for low wage service sector workers once we get that consensus that we better do it. That's what I would do. And I'd run my campaigns, like I said, a bit more openly, and not my campaigns, the campaigns I was involved in, more openly from the beginning. That's what I would do.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brad, and thank you so much for your insights. And thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Bill, so much for the discussion today, as well as your patience with me. Anyways, thank you to all once again, okay, and all the best.